I want to talk about a technique, a simple technique, journaling, that has remarkable consequences. Just so I get a show of hands, how many people keep a journal or have kept a journal for a significant amount of time? Okay, that's great. That's great to see. We know from this course and research that you've encountered before how difficult change is. Sometimes programs that have been around for 5 years don't help. Very often interventions were millions and billions. It's about $100 billion a year industry, the change industry in organizations. Most of the interventions don't work. We know how difficult it is to change. And yet journaling, very solid research showing how much it helps. So let me share with you a study. This was done by the person who really brought journaling into the scientific realm. So there have been people like Ira Progoff and others who have been talking about journaling for a very long time. But it was Jamie Pennybaker from the University of Texas, Austin, who brought this idea to the scientific realm and really researched it. And here is what he did. What he did was bring in participants and have them do the following. On 4 consecutive days that they came in, each day they would spend 15 minutes. That's all, 15 minutes times 4, writing about their most difficult experiences. Now they knew that no one would see it, or if they would see it, it would be without a name, completely confidential, so they were really able to treat it as their own journal. And here was the instructions that these participants got. It's a little long, but worth reading. Write continuously about the most upsetting or traumatic experience of your entire life. Don't worry about grammar, spelling, or sentence structure. In your writing, I want you to discuss your deepest thoughts and feelings about the experience. You can write about anything you want, but whatever you choose, it should be something that has affected you very deeply. Ideally, it should be about something you have not talked about with others in detail. It is critical, however, that you let yourself go and touch those deepest emotions and thoughts that you have. In other words, write about what happened and how you felt about it and how you feel about it now. Finally, you can write on different traumas during each session or the same one over the entire study. Your choice of trauma for each session is entirely up to you. Simple instructions, pretty straightforward. If you notice, you see the ABCs in it. So it says write about what happened, which is the behavior essentially. Write about your deepest feelings, your affect, your emotions, and write about your thought. Analyze it. The ABCs in journaling. So when he did this study, initially, and the results came in, because one of the first things that he looked at was their anxiety levels. When the results came in, disappointment. In fact, thinking of stopping the study because this is what he found. So if we have this graph, this would be anxiety level. This would be time. He had a control group, and the control group just wrote about anything that they wanted to write about, showed no change over time. So they started here, and they essentially straight line. The intervention group, the experimental group, after 4 days of writing about their most traumatic, most difficult experiences, they started at the same point. They were randomly divided. And then a rise in their anxiety. After each of the days and during the 4 days, rise in their levels of anxiety. And at this point, he was thinking of terminating the study. Very disappointed, because he got it from personal experience. He knew that journaling helps him, and he knew other people who talk about it, who swear by journaling. But then, once the 4 days were over, during the 5th, especially starting 6th, 7th, and on days, this is what started to happen. Their anxiety levels went down. Not only did they reach the same level as before, they continued to go down. And the most important thing is that they stabilized below the previous level. They stabilized below the previous levels of anxiety. When he followed these participants over a longer period of time, up to a year. 4 times 15 minutes, that's a total of an hour. That's very little. And long-lasting results. Think about it, this is also what we saw before. Sometimes brief interventions are extremely effective. Think about the shyness study that I spoke about last week. After 12 sessions of 12 minutes with women who were interested in them, these shy heterosexual men change radically. So change can come in a relatively brief period of time if we know how to intervene. And journaling is one of these interventions. Now, this is not going to be one of your response papers. It's too personal. I don't think it's appropriate to assign it, but I certainly do recommend that you do it. Follow specifically Penny Baker's instructions. Doesn't take that long. Do it on 4 days, 15 minutes, 20 minutes each time, and just write whatever comes to mind. So there was reduced anxiety over time. Other results of this study, and if you want to read much more about it, here's a wonderful book out called Opening Up by Jamie Pennybaker. They became healthier. So over the year of the study, they visited the doctor's office compared to a control group far less. In other words, it strengthened their immune system, not just their psychological immune system, their physiological immune system. Generally, they were in a better mood. They were happier, more jovial, more benefit finders after writing about their deepest traumas. They became more outgoing, less repressed, less suppressed. Now, why is that? We talked about it often that positive emotions and painful emotions flow through the same pipeline. And if we suppress something, if we stop something which is painful, we're very often indirectly, inadvertently also suppressing the positive emotions. Whereas here, when they open up, quite literally open up and allow these emotions to flow through them, they're essentially opening up a clogged channel through which emotions, painful as well as positive emotions, normally flow. And they experience higher levels of happiness. They're more open, more generous, as we saw also when we do the gratitude exercise. Very similar results. There were gender differences, which is interesting. Now, both sexes benefited from it. However, men benefited more than women. Think about it. Why do you think that is? And it makes sense if you think about it. Women benefited significantly, got better. But men benefited even more. Why? Because women have, generally speaking, again, this is broad brushstroke stereotype, but generally speaking, women open up more. They speak more with their girlfriends, they have closer friends, and they talk about issues. Men, still in our culture today, are much more closed because it's not cool to open up. It's not cool to give yourself the permission to be human, especially when others are listening. So women generally in their lives have more of these support systems than men. But still, even women who have strong support systems still benefit from this exercise. Which reminds me of another result of a study I mentioned a month ago at the beginning of the course, which is that women generally, again, these are all averages, but in general, women, or rather men, benefit more from marriage than women. For a similar reason. Because women already have the support system in place. Men, very often, for the first time, they're with someone whom they feel comfortable enough opening up to. And both male and female benefit from a long-term relationship, but men generally tend to benefit more than women. For the same reason that he found gender differences here. Cross cultures. This was done in China, in Japan, Mexico, Argentina, United States, of course, Europe, replicated across cultures. In all cultures, people benefit from this study. Here's another study which took the exact opposite approach. So Laura King was a student of Penny Baker, took the exact opposite approach and said, let's study what happens when the individuals write about their most intense positive experience. And what she did specifically was take the instructions from Abraham Maslow's work on peak experience. And here are the instructions. Once again, this was 3 times 15 minutes, so 45 minutes total on 3 consecutive days. Think of the most wonderful experience or experiences in your life. Happiest moments, ecstatic moments, moments of rapture, perhaps from being in love or from listening to music or suddenly being hit by a book or painting or from some great creative moment. Choose one such experience or moment. Try to imagine yourself at that moment, including all the feelings and emotions associated with the experience. Now, write about the experience in as much detail as possible, trying to include the feelings, thoughts, and emotions that were present at the time. Please try your best to re-experience the emotions involved. Essentially the exact opposite of Penny Baker. Results? Identical. Those who wrote about their peak experiences, their best experiences, visited the doctor's office less times. In other words, it strengthened their physiological immune system and experienced more happiness, so both psychological and physiological results. Now, when you look at this, some of you may be thinking back, well, what about the Lyubomirsky study? Remember the Lyubomirsky study that said when you write about positive emotions, actually you feel worse. Whereas when you write about negative emotions, you do feel better, as Penny Baker suggested. Here is the difference. The instructions that Laura King gave were mostly about describing and re-experiencing, replaying your experience. It wasn't about analyzing why did it happen, it was rather how it happened. In other words, replaying it. When the instructions, and this is the Lyubomirsky study, were analyze the experience, why it happened, how did you get there, and so on, that's when it had the negative consequences over time. But just replaying the experience, just writing about how wonderful it is, re-experiencing emotionally what that was, that actually led to benefits. Now, the interesting question is why? Why are there such remarkable benefits to journaling? Let's understand the process, the mechanism. So there are a few things that are at play here. One of the things, for example, with positive emotions is that when you're replaying it, you're fortifying the neural pathways. You replay it, you imagine it again, and you make it more likely to happen again. Just like when you have a river, remember the analogy from 2 weeks ago, you have a river, and the more water goes through it, the wider it becomes, and then the more water is likely to go into it. That's the self-reinforcing nature of change. So the first reason why writing, especially about painful emotions, but not just painful emotions, the reason why it helps is because of tension. We talked about ironic processing, Daniel Wagner's work from here, and what he talks about is that when we suppress a natural phenomenon, it often intensifies, be it thinking about a pink elephant, or be it suppressing painful emotions. And when we give ourselves the permission to be human, we're much more likely to release it, to let go, which is why therapy helps, which is why sharing with friends, opening up helps, which is why journaling helps. This is the whole idea of suppression or repression. The second thing that Penny Baker talks about is coherence. One of the things that he finds is that the individuals who benefit most, and he analyzes the text, confidentially of course, but he analyzes the text, the individuals who benefit most from this study are ones who introduced a lot of insight words or insight phrases, meaning by the third day they're already writing, now I see that, or I understand that, or it just dawned on me that, or I realize that. Those who have many of these words or phrases in their writings are the ones who benefited most. In other words, they've created a sense of coherence out of the experience. They made sense out of something that perhaps before that was senseless. Or in other words, they created a story around their experiences. It's no longer disparate, disjointed, disconnected data. Now it is a coherent whole. It's a story. Now I can deal with it. And if you think about it, what do people mostly remember? People mostly remember stories. Why? Because you remember a story because it's one unit. It's a whole. If I'd given you now a collection of, 100 random words, it would take you a very long time to commit it to memory. I mean, we all know, we all took the SATs. But if I tell you a story, you're much more likely to remember it. Maybe not word for word, but certainly the general ideas. Because we can hold it, we can grasp it, because it has a sense of coherence. I can deal with it, I can handle it, as opposed to some disparate ideas, disjointed words. The exact same here. We want to feel that our lives have a sense of coherence, that we can make sense of them. Pennebaker. An artifact of our ambiguous and unpredictable world is the anxiety of not attaining completion and not understanding a simple cause and effect explanation for traumatic disturbances. Alas, we naturally search for meaning and the completion of events. It gives us a sense of control and predictability over our lives. Again, that's why therapy helps, because we create coherence out of experiences. This is why there was far less post-traumatic stress disorder after the Holocaust than there was after the Vietnam War. Because after the Holocaust, they spoke about these experiences. They created a story around it. A tragic one, but still there was a sense of coherence. As opposed to Vietnam, when it was just random flashes of experiences without giving themselves the permission, or without society in many ways giving them the permission to open up and to create a story out of it that they could handle, they could grasp. The work of Pennebaker, to a great extent, relies on the work of a psychologist whom we've mentioned on the very first day of class, and that is Aaron Antonovsky. Aaron Antonovsky, whom I consider to be one of the fathers of positive psychology, if you remember, came up with the notion of salutogenesis, an alternative to the pathogenic model. Pathogenic model, the model that focuses on pathology, on sickness and illness, whereas what Antonovsky said is, we need to focus on the origins of health. Saluto, health, genesis, origin. And what he did specifically was the following. So he was a sociologist, and he said the following. He said, look, life is tough. People go through hardship. They go through difficulties. Whether we like it or not, we all in life encountered hardships. In a relationship, in school, at work, wherever, whichever domain, there are hardships, there are difficulties. Life is hard, period. We know that. However, there are some people who are able to better deal with the hardship, with the difficulties, who still, despite, they don't do away with these hardships, despite these hardships and difficulties, are still able to lead a full, fulfilling, and overall happy life. Not the constant high that's reserved for psychopaths and dead people, with the same ups and downs, but at a higher level of well-being, or at a lower level of anxiety. And he said we need to study those. We shouldn't just study the sick people. Whether the sick people who are physically ill, which is mostly the pathogenic model of medicine, or the people who are unwell psychologically, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, as psychology has mostly studied. He said we need to look at the healthy people and study them, which is exactly the model that led to asking the question in the 1980s with at-risk population, what makes some individuals succeed despite unfavorable circumstances? It was his question that made all the difference. So he did the same in his research and asked about the general population. Who are the people who are healthy, and what is the origin of that health? What distinguishes them from other people? And he came up with the notion of the sense of coherence. The people have a sense of coherence about their lives. What that means, he said that it has three components that he researched and identified. The first component, a sense of comprehensibility. I understand the world. It makes sense to me. I see, I realize, I get it. The world, an event, difficulties and hardships, highs and lows, make sense to me mostly. Second, sense of manageability. I can deal with it. I can handle it. I have the internal as well as external resources to deal with it, as opposed to being helpless. This is a sense of efficacy, of confidence in being able to deal with the hardships that arise. So that's the second component. The third and final component that makes up a sense of coherence, according to Antonovsky, is a sense of meaningfulness. This was not in vain, this difficulty. This disagreement with my partner was not for nothing, because we understand one another better now, and we're even closer, more intimate. This failure was not in vain. I have learned from it, and I have grown from it. This mistake has a reason, and again, not necessarily happened for the best, but learning how to make the best of what happens. These three components are what he identified and was replicated in later research as the source of mental health. To quote Antonovsky, a sense of coherence, a global orientation that expresses the extent to which one has a pervasive, enduring, though dynamic feeling of confidence that, 1. The stimuli deriving from one's internal and external environments in the course of living are structured, predictable, and explicable. Comprehensible, in other words. 2. The resources are available to one to meet the demands posed by these stimuli. Internal resources and external resources. I can deal with it, I can manage. And 3, these demands are challenges worthy of investment and engagement. It's meaningful. Look at these three, and for all those who write a journal, I bet you can identify these three in your writings. This is what a journal does to a great extent. When we write, and when we really write about our experiences, our difficult experiences, this is very often what comes out, a sense of coherence. I see, I understand, makes sense. I can deal with it, I can handle it. I've just found a path of how to do it. Even if dealing with it and handling it is writing a journal. And finally, it makes sense to me, it's meaningful to me now, whereas before it didn't as much. So if you don't have a journal and you don't journal, it is certainly something that I highly, highly recommend. Let me summarize the whole change lecture. The A, B, and the C. The three are interconnected. In fact, if we want real change to come about, they have to be interconnected. Why? Because habit is like a flood. And it's not enough if we just create a small nook or a cranny trying to create a new habit, because the flood will wash it away. What we need is the A, the B, and the C. Implement these changes in our lives. And they are interconnected. So let me give you an example. Let's say someone who has low self-esteem. Low self-esteem, the C, cognition, they don't think highly of themselves. Poor self-evaluation. When you don't think highly of yourself, you're much more likely to be enervated, to feel down, not to be motivated. And as a result of that, that is the affect, the emotion that you experience, not good feelings. As a result of that, we're much more likely to do nothing. In other words, the B is do nothing. Now, through self-perception theory, the behavior then affects my cognition. I'm doing nothing, I'm not dealing, I'm not coping, I'm avoiding, and that lowers my self-esteem even more, my evaluation of myself, the C, and that leads to even worse emotions, and so on and so on and so on in a downward spiral until, in some cases, we reach resignation, or in Marty Seligman's words, learned helplessness. Now think of someone who has high self-esteem, high levels of self-confidence. I believe in myself, I think I can do well. That leads to high levels of motivation. Remember what Marva Collins does, the model that we talked about under beliefs as self-fulfilling prophecies. That leads to high levels of motivation, strong emotions, I'm energized, and that in turn leads to more action. The B, the behaviors. Because I act more, I do more, I cope more, I put myself on the line more, I'm much more likely to have a more positive evaluation of myself, which leads to more positive emotions and on and on and on in an upward spiral. The spiral that Barbara Fredrickson talks about in the Broaden and Build, the spiral that Bandura talks about when he discusses self-efficacy. When we intervene, it's important to introduce, if possible, all three, and we can start anywhere. So let's take an example of someone with social phobia, someone who is afraid to be out there in front of people. One way to deal with it, let's begin with the A, the affect, the emotion. One way to deal with it is through medication that goes directly to our emotions. Another way of dealing with it is meditation, which also affects our emotions directly. Some people benefit more from one or from the other. Depends also how extreme the situation is. But that's the A, the affect. One way of dealing with the behavior is through what's called in cognitive behavioral therapy exposure, which is gradual exposure to the stimuli that create that phobia. So initially, I'll walk 10 yards out of my home. Initially, exposure through the imagination, and I include it under behavior because the mind doesn't know the difference between the imaginary and the real. So gradually being exposed to the stimuli, and over time being exposed more and more until I can go out to a mall and not experience the same anxiety that I did a year ago. So that's through behavior. Very effective, the exposure technique. And finally, you can also intervene through cognition. In therapy, in dealing with irrational thoughts, psychological traps, the 3 M's. Am I magnifying the extent? Am I minimizing something? For example, my successes in working with people, or am I making up imaginary scenarios? Am I catastrophizing events when I can have a more realistic view? So that's by thinking about it, the cognition. Let me share with you a personal example of something that I dealt with. So as you know, born through genes, high levels of anxiety, very prone to it, startled very easily, still to less today, but still to some extent today. Used to get very nervous in squash matches, used to choke often when I was playing important games. And that's something that speaking in front of an audience, got very nervous and anxious, and this is something that I decided that I really wanted to deal with, more than any other thing that I was facing, this anxiety. So what did I do? Let me begin first with the C, cognition. So what I did, I analyzed the situation in my journal. I used the Bureau of Study Council. I learned and studied about the 3 M's, the irrational thoughts, magnifying, minimizing, making up, catastrophizing. And through cognition, it helped a lot. But that wasn't enough. After the C, I went to the A, the affect. And the affect was, for me, physical exercise. Even today, this morning at home, I ran. I exercised because significantly lowers anyone's levels of anxiety. And I can tell a significant difference in my talks if I don't exercise. So even, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, David, my son, was unwell, and I had to take him to the doctor first thing Tuesday morning. Didn't have time to exercise. I actually felt it in lecture. I was more nervous, more anxious. Makes a big difference. As we'll talk about after break, it literally has the same effect as taking an anti-anxiety pill. So exercise was certainly there, work directly on my emotion. Yoga helped me tremendously in dealing with anxiety and lowering that level. So this was the emotional. The other thing, music. Relaxing music. You know my taste in music. I don't need to repeat it again. So actually when Tommy and I got married and we moved in together, she couldn't believe my collection of CDs. She said, "You don't look that anxious," because I had the most relaxing classical music in the world, music for relaxation, music for dealing with anxiety, silent, quiet music. I mean, a whole shelf of these but they relaxed me. They really helped me. And finally, behavior. Introducing behavior. So it was through exposure, initially giving a talk, because I wanted to be a teacher, giving a talk to my squash team, giving a talk to my family, places that were safe for me, giving a talk to anyone who would listen, initially small groups, and gradually building it up. Exposure through the imagination. Once again, the imaginary thing. And over time becoming more confident. Another thing that for me was very significant as an undergrad here, speaking up in section. I was terrified of speaking up. And when I decided to do that, I had no doubt in my mind that everyone in section could hear my heartbeat, because it was in my head. And yet, gradually, I spoke up a little bit more, and then through self-perception theory, it actually got better and better and better. And I still do all these things. I still do yoga. I still exercise regularly. I still engage in the CBT approach, the 3 M's. I keep a journal, which combines very often all 3. And I listen to relaxing music. And it works. It works. Now, change is not easy. It is hard. It takes time. However, that doesn't mean that the process itself cannot be enjoyable. It's not, okay, when I've changed, then I'll be happy. The process itself is potentially extremely rewarding. Sometimes difficult. Potentially very rewarding. The journey as well as the destination. The other important thing to remember about change, this is taken from the work of really the person who took psychoanalysis and transformed it into a more positive approach, Karen Horney, whom I've mentioned before. What she says about neuroses is that neuroses never go away completely. And when she says neurosis, she means it in the broadest sense. So for example, if I'm a perfectionist, I'll always have some perfectionism in me, and we'll talk about it after the break. If I'm prone to anxiety, I'll never be the Dalai Lama, unlikely. So it will always be there, and it will always be potentially triggered by an event. And she says that's okay, that's natural, that's human. And we need to accept it, because if we don't accept it, then we'll be constantly frustrated, because we'd want to change completely, or expect our partner to change completely. Very difficult, unrealistic. It takes time, it's gradual. And we need to also learn, and we can learn to enjoy the process. Henry David Thoreau, 1840s. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of man to elevate his life by conscious endeavor. It is something to be able to paint a particular picture or to carve a statue, and so to make a few objects beautiful. But it is far more glorious to carve and paint the very atmosphere and medium through which we look, which morally we can do. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts. And again, it's the process, it's not the outcome that matters more. The outcome will lead to a spike, but very quickly we'll go back to our base level. It's the process of actually doing those activities, the A's, the B's, and the C's, that will lead to a happier, not perfect, not happiest, but happier life. Over time, it takes time to carve out like a statue, chipping away the excess stone, the limitations, and building a beautiful life. It is not only the highest of art, it is also, I would argue, a high science, and that is the science of psychology.